Guys, welcome to Trinity Youth. We could not be more excited to be kicking off this year together. It's been a pretty crazy few months, hey? Well, you need to know that our youth leaders have been praying for you a ton, especially as you've transitioned back into school this fall. We know everything looks just a little bit different than we're all used to. If we haven't met, my name's Sarah and I'm part of the youth team. Now, this is the part where we would typically gather all together in one space on a youth night before we'd break off into small groups. Well, we can't do that these days. Do you know what I think is pretty awesome? When we moved youth online last spring and met on Zoom, the biggest thing we heard from you is that you wanted more time in your small groups. We love that. And this fall, that's exactly what it's gonna look like. And the best part, you have the world's greatest small group leaders. For real. Some of you have known your small group leader for years. And some of you, well, you're going to discover pretty quickly that they're pretty amazing. Some of your leaders, they're working full time. Others are in school. They have friends, families, and lots going on. And they show up every week because they care about you. Because they love Jesus and they want to help you discover how crazy loved you are by God. Now, even though we're meeting in different spaces all across our physical church building and some online, we're still in this together. We're still going to be learning together and diving into the Bible together and asking really big questions and talking about life together. Now, I don't know what your summer looked like, but mine looked like a lot of time at home, discovering new hikes around the Okanagan, swimming in the lake, and a couple of road trips, mostly for ice cream. But as it gets colder out, I spent a little bit more time inside, and that means books and movies. Okay, really quickly here, are you more of a book person or are you more of a movie person? I think I'm about 50-50 because I love hanging out in my hammock on the back porch with a good book, but I also love making popcorn and curling up on the couch and picking a great movie. Sometimes I feel like an action movie, one that keeps me on my toes and is full of adventure and risk. Other times, I could go for one of those movies that's based on a true story or a classic chick flick, the kind that makes you ugly cry. But I think my favorite kind, whether it's a book or a movie, are the ones with surprise twists, where I think it's going one way and then all of a sudden something totally unexpected happens that catches me completely off guard. How about you? Take a couple of minutes and talk about it together. Are you more of a book person or more of a movie person? What's your favorite kind of book or movie? So good. I'm curious, was your group all over the map, or do you like the same kind of books and movies? Well, here's the thing. No matter what kind, action or comedy, book or movie, each one tells a story. We're drawn to stories, aren't we? We get sucked into them. We love to hear them, tell them, and be part of them. There's a quote by an author that says, 2 or 3 things I know for sure. And one of them is that to go on living, I have to tell stories. That stories are the one sure way I know to touch the heart and change the world. I love that. Stories touch the heart and change the world. I remember as a kid, one of my favorite things was to ask my mom or dad to tell me a story about them when they were growing up. And then I decided that I wanted to be an author, and I wrote some pretty hilarious books that ended up in the elementary school library. An example, How the Porcupine Got Its Quills. As I got older, I discovered that the best kind of stories were the ones that changed me, that stuck with me. The ones that made me laugh, made me cry, that challenged me to think differently, or shifted my perspective. This year, together, we're going to discover and tell stories. In fact, we're going to soak in one big story, God's story. And as a church this fall, we're starting from the very beginning and working our way through a book called, literally, The Story. See, the Bible? It's full of hundreds of stories. Some are full of action, some feel more like a drama, and others have crazy, unexpected twists and turns. And each one is part of God's big story, the one that He's been writing since the beginning, and it's not done yet. Sometimes when we read the Bible, it can be hard to understand how it all fits together, that it's not just a bunch of random stories, but that they're all connected, that they all work together to tell one big story. And what we'll start to discover is that when we begin at the beginning, we see God's fingerprint all over it, from beginning to end, and it gives us a clearer picture of Jesus. Maybe you grew up in the church. You've been learning about stories from the Bible since you were really little. Or maybe this is your first time ever at youth or at church. That's awesome. If there's one thing that I've realized as I've followed Jesus, it's that no matter how old I am or how much time I've spent reading the Bible, I always have more questions, and there's always more to discover. And as we dive into the story together this year, I hope that's true for you too. We hope you ask really big questions. We hope that you discover things you didn't know before. Because I know I still have a ton to learn, and your leaders do too. Next week, we'll start with chapter 1 right at the beginning of the Bible. But before we get there, take a few minutes to talk about it. Did you grow up going to church or reading the Bible at home? Or is it brand new to you, like a movie that you've seen the trailer for, but you haven't watched yet? Either way, we all have a ton to learn, and we're so pumped that we get to do it together. What questions do you have about the Bible? Your leaders can write them down and make sure that we come back to them over the year together. Dive in. You know what I'm really excited about? I'm excited that as we dive into this year together, we're not only going to get to know God's big story better, but you're going to get to know each other's stories too, just like you've already started to. I hope that you asked some really big questions. And you know what? When we ask really big questions, it's also okay if we don't know the answers right away. To say, that's a great question. Let's figure it out together. This year, we're not just going to get to know God's story or each other's stories. You know what we're praying is that you would discover where your story fits within God's big story. That you would encounter a God who loves you more than you could possibly imagine. That He created you, wired you with unique gifts and passions, and that you come alive when you put them into action. And that you would discover that God has incredible plans for you as you follow Jesus to impact your friends, your school, and beyond. Remember, stories have the ability to touch the heart and change the world. That includes your story. I grew up going to church pretty much every weekend. I learned all kinds of stories from the Bible, that God loved me, and I saw my parents following Jesus, reading their Bibles, being involved in church, and inviting others to do life together. I believed in God. And then, when I was 10 years old, my family made a big move, like literally across the world to a completely different country and a totally foreign culture. It meant leaving all of our friends and family, and it was really hard. Life in the Philippines, it looked totally different than here in Canada. I realized quickly that not everyone was growing up like I was. I saw poverty, kids my age who had very little when it came to simple things that I took for granted, like food or clothing. And to be honest, it rocked my faith. It made me ask really big questions. How could this good God that I'd learned about my whole life allow people to struggle and live like this? Why did my life look so different? I wrestled with my faith, and I wasn't sure how all of the stories fit together. But over the next few years, I discovered that God, He was very much alive and at work in the Philippines too. And I met friends whose lives and whose stories looked completely different than mine, who had different struggles, but who had encountered the same God, who loved Jesus, and who were also figuring out what it meant to follow Him. That was a turning point for me in my story. It was when my faith went from simply believing that there was a God to actually having a relationship with Jesus. It was when I began to discover where my story fit into the bigger picture of God's story. So I'm not sure where you're at today. Maybe you're just starting to learn about God. You're asking questions. You're skeptical. You're not sure about what you've seen of the church or heard about the Bible. Maybe you're on fire for Jesus and you can't wait to see what chapter He's going to write next in your story. Or perhaps you're somewhere in the middle. It's great. No matter what, we couldn't be more glad that you're here. We want you to dig in and ask questions and share stories and read the Bible and get to know Jesus. Like we said, we're in this together. And we can't wait to discover the greatest story ever and where your story fits into it. One of my very favorite passages in the Bible, it's found in the book of Ephesians, chapter 5. And as I think about this year ahead, I'm praying it for you, for your small group, and for all of us as we do life together. It says this: mostly what God does is love you. Keep company with him and learn a life of love. Observe how Christ loved us. His love was not cautious, but extravagant. He didn't love in order to get something from us, but to give everything of himself to us. Love like that. That's what I've discovered as I've followed Jesus. And it's what I pray that we experience together as we read the Bible and experience the story. So now, talk about it. Take a few minutes to chat, to share prayer requests, and to pray together. What are you most excited about this year? Is there anything that you're feeling unsure of or anxious about? And how can we be praying for each other this week?